Good afternoon. There is a new handout today, different from the one I gave you at the very beginning of the week, so please be sure to get that. As soon as you get it, you can set it aside. We may not even get to it today, and I'd really ask that you not be distracted by looking at it because we have a lot of material to cover again. When we get to it and when it's relevant, I'll let you know, but it may not even be today, okay? So if you would just get that and set it aside, thanks. Yesterday, we were considering various forms of irrationality, rationalization, base tagging, etc. We noted also some of rationality's general requirements, and in particular there I was stressing the importance of identification, identifying facts as precisely and thoroughly as you can, emulating Ayn Rand in being a namer, that as an extremely important dimension or requirement of being rational. Now today we have to finish up that discussion. There were just a couple of last brief points in explaining various of the general requirements of rationality. So let's turn to those. This is B6 for those of you who are still following on the outline, okay? All the moral virtues, as I've already said once or twice, all of the moral virtues are reflections of rationality applied to different issues. But particularly I would stress two virtues as crucial to rationality. First of all, honesty. Yesterday we noted temptations of self-deception and various forms of self-deception. You've got to be honest to be rational about internal facts, your beliefs, your emotions, your abilities, etc., as well as external facts. Introspection reveals an important dimension of reality that you've got to pay attention to in trying to be rational. It's often more difficult because the stakes can be highly charged. The stakes are often emotionally laden, and the pull of those emotions can lure us away from being fully honest. So you've got to beware of describing or redescribing or dishonestly describing to yourself certain of your own tendencies. You've got to beware of, well, same point, forget it. Dishonesty, notice, plays a role in many of the forms of irrationality that we talked about yesterday. Not just the various forms of self-deception, but it can be dishonesty with oneself that leads one to rationalize, or to drop context sometimes, to compartmentalize, to maintain incompatible goals, etc. So honesty is a prerequisite for rationality. Without honesty, rationality and its object, the purpose of being rational, grasping reality, are going to be hopeless. And bear in mind that Rand once said, and I forget, I think this was in her journals, but I'm not sure exactly where this was, but she was considering the questions, what is responsible for these tremendous achievements that I have made in my life? You know, is it my intelligence? Is it that I'm just super bright? Am I that much more intelligent than other people? And her thought was, no, my honesty is more responsible. And that's rather an inspiring thought, especially to those of us, you know, intelligence-wise, God, right? You can at least be honest. The second virtue that I would stress as crucial for rationality is independence. First-handedness, relying on your own judgment, making your own identifications and integrations. Rand, in her journals, observed that treating other men as an authority foils a person's rationality. It erects a false master, a false standard. It inserts an artificial and irrelevant layer between you and your grasp of reality. Being rational requires a steadfast independence, having your feet firmly set in your own judgment. An imperfect analogy that might be helpful. It is imperfect, but this might help. To grasp reality visually, to see 20/20, you wouldn't wear another person's glasses, right? Even if that person said, oh, my glasses, they're great, I can see perfectly with them, right? You wouldn't grab that person's glasses and think they're going to work for you. Well, similarly, to grasp reality intellectually, it's self-defeating to adopt another person's conclusions, another person's beliefs. To defer to him is to abandon the aim of tracking reality. His beliefs could be true or false, but you can't tell, you won't know, except by utilizing your own first-hand judgment. Okay? All right, so that completes part 3, I guess. All right? Next, then, we can turn to objectivity. Among the things that rationality requires is objectivity, yet it warrants special attention for a few reasons. It's central to objectivism. It is itself an abstract and potentially difficult concept, objectivity. And it's, if not confused in many people's minds, I think at least fuzzy, at least not as clear as we might hope it would be in a lot of our understanding. Okay, so for these reasons, I do think it warrants as much attention as we're going to give it today and tomorrow. I don't think its importance needs a great deal of rehearsal for this audience. The truth of all sorts of issues, on claims about big issues, depends on whether the claims put forward are objectively valid. But we can't understand what it is for something to be objectively valid until we understand what objectivity itself is. There are considerable misconceptions about the nature of objectivity afloat around us in our culture. And as we found with rationality, I think clarifying what objectivity is will go a long way to showing why we should be objective. We'll also find some overlap with rationality, and later on today I'll discuss the relationship between the two, a question that may already have occurred to you, okay? There is, though, before we get started, one noteworthy difference in the contemporary status of rationality and objectivity. In an important sense, I think, attacks on objectivity are already further along than attacks on reason. Let me tell you what I mean. I think there's already been greater success in attacking objectivity, such that warped ideas of what objectivity is are more deeply entrenched. What I mean is this. Many people are hazy about what rationality is. If you walked up to the average person on the street and asked, what is reason, what is rationality, they would have a hard time telling you. They would struggle, they would grope, they would come up with something, but we don't all have on the tip of our tongues a definition of rationality. With objectivity, however, I think most people hold downright wrong ideas of what objectivity is that they are quite confident are correct. They think they understand objectivity in a way. They wouldn't grope there in the same way that they would grope if you asked them to define rationality. They're more confident that they know what objectivity is, but their ideas of what it is tend to be erroneous. And while many people would knock reason as overrated along the lines that we talked about a few days ago, even more people are inclined to dismiss objectivity as impossible. Remember some of those quotations from the first day, the Washington Post ombudsman saying, we dismissed objectivity as a pretentious fantasy, and I read you some other quotes to that same effect. Those attitudes are ubiquitous. Part of how I got interested in this subject was on realizing, in maybe my second or third year of teaching at the University of Texas, that my students, many of them, couldn't even conceive of what objectivity was. It wasn't just that they were subjectivists who opposed objectivity. I started to gain the impression that they couldn't even conceive of an objective point of view or an objective fact, okay? So this skepticism about its possibility is ubiquitous. To a large extent, that's a result of having wrong ideas of what objectivity is. If you equate it with a mistaken conception of what it is, then you can dismiss it when you find that mistaken conception of what it is truly is impossible, right? That leads you to think, I guess objectivity itself is impossible. So, the agenda today then is to clarify what objectivity is and begin discussing why we should be objective. What objectivity is. I think it's clearest to begin with several examples, considering a few decisions that people can make where proceeding objectively or non-objectively, where what the two objective or non-objective procedures would be are pretty clear-cut, pretty apparent. Okay, so we're starting out with several simple, straightforward examples. And I've just referred to them up here on the board. That first one says city councilman, if you can't see what that says. Consider the city council member who votes to award a city contract, for some new building or road or something. The city council member who votes to award a contract to the company that's made the most cost-efficient bid, that's given the most realistic timetables, has the best track record in terms of the quality of their previous work, right? That's one way of making this decision. Or the city council member who votes to award the contract on the basis of which company has contributed the most to his campaign to his past election campaigns and is likely to contribute the most to his upcoming re-election campaign, right? An objective and non-objective way of proceeding. Or consider the journalist who writes to accurately convey what was said and done at a press conference, or the journalist who writes to most rile up the readers against the president, who he deems is, a lousy president. Or who writes so as to grab the most sensational headline to get his byline on the front page, help him in renegotiating his contract with the newspaper next week, okay? The research biologist can fake results to cover a devastating finding. He can lie about his latest experiments so as to maintain publication in the prestigious journal that's supposed to come out next week. Or he can admit what he has found and that the track of research he's been on for the past 3 years turns out to be a dead end after all. Right? Proceeding objectively, non-objectively. Reversed, obviously. Right? The juror can vote for acquittal or conviction on the basis of his own honest evaluation of the evidence, the testimony presented by both sides, carefully, scrupulously weighing everything he's heard, or he can vote on the basis of the ethnic background of the defendant, right? Hey, he's a fellow Mexican, so that's all I need to know. The teacher can grade papers according to their merits, giving a particular paper a B because that's its quality, or on the basis of the fact that a B would lower the GPA of this student and eliminate his eligibility for his scholarship, something like that. Or finally, the sports referee, who can make calls so as to favor the team that he prefers, the one he wants to win the game, or according to the rules in force and the play, the pitch, etc., as he saw it. Okay? What's the lesson from looking at these examples? They clue us into the basic nature of objectivity. Like rationality, objectivity concerns the way you use your mind. That's what it's about. It's about one's manner of using one's thinking capacity. Objectivity is not a property or a quality of certain beliefs, but a method of thinking. Objectivity refers to how individuals reach conclusions, the basis on which a person endorses a claim. The objective method consists of proceeding according to the facts, logically evaluating the relevant evidence. Proceeding according to the facts, logically evaluating the relevant evidence, giving proper weight to various strands of evidence, and tracing their logical implications. Now, when I say proceeding according to the facts, proceeding, I mean inferring, drawing conclusions, and then ultimately making decisions and acting on the basis of these conclusions. It's a matter of basing your conclusions on the facts, the evidence, not on your wishes, guesses, hunches, horoscope, prayers, likes, affinities, antipathies, what's popular, what will please someone else, what some authority decrees, etc. So there are clearly two key elements to highlight here. First of all, pursuing the facts as crucial to objectivity. Pursuing the facts as opposed to what you might like to believe, what's easy to believe, convenient, comfortable, what someone else has arbitrarily suggested, etc. The objective method is marked by hunting down the facts as opposed to settling for conclusions based on emotion, desire, or other irrelevant considerations, like the juror, for instance, okay? At root, a commitment to objectivity is a commitment to discovering the way things are and drawing the conclusions that that discovery dictates. Now, the second element to highlight is proceeding according to the relevant evidence. Notice, it may be a fact that the defendant is Mexican, but that's irrelevant. It may be a fact that the student will lose his scholarship if he is given a certain grade, right? But that seems irrelevant. It may be a fact that the president is awful or that the reporter is underappreciated, but distorting the story to reflect those things is wrong because those facts are irrelevant. Why are these things irrelevant? How can we establish what is relevant when we're trying to be objective? By reference to the purpose of the enterprise and reality. And I'll elaborate a little bit on each, okay? But basically, by reference to the purpose of the enterprise, be it a trial, the reporting of a story, grading papers, etc., the purpose of the enterprise and reality. So first on purpose. The purpose of a trial is to determine guilt or innocence, so it only makes sense, it's only appropriate to heed facts that bear on that. The purpose of grading papers is to give an honest appraisal of the quality of a student's work, his mastery of a certain subject. The purpose of a newspaper story is to report significant events, what happened, not to influence the career of the subject of the story or the author of the story, the journalist. Without knowing your purpose, you can't know which facts to pay attention to, which facts are relevant. Simple example, right? Suppose Sandra Schwartz was sorting out a lot of papers before the conference to make those packets that you all individually got designed for you, okay? And suppose she gave one of her assistants a bunch of these different papers that she had gotten from you, you know, in the weeks before the conference, and just said to this person, here, sort these. Natural question, well, how? You know, how do you want me to sort them? Just sort them, right? Well, by what features? By what criteria should I sort them? Just sort them. What are you looking for? What are you trying to identify? What's your purpose here, right? There's a lot of information on these pages. There's people's names, their home state, their careers. We know the date that, you know, we received this, the date of their check, etc. What are you looking for? Are you trying to figure out who owes more money because the rates went up after a certain date? Are you trying to compile the page of hobbies, etc.? That, what you're looking for, the purpose, determines what's relevant, okay? What's relevant depends on what you're after. Correspondingly, relevance is contextual. What's relevant varies. In choosing your friends, inviting people to a party, it's relevant whether you like the person. In grading their papers or evaluating their work, that's irrelevant, whether you like the person. It's not always easy to determine what's relevant. So far, I've been going over very simple examples today. Are an employee's religious beliefs relevant to his suitability for a certain job? In many cases, no. In many cases, they are completely irrelevant to how well he might do a certain job. But if he insists on being off because it's a holy day in his faith, the day that's busiest at the business, if he's proselytizing in the office and antagonizing other workers, right? If the business is itself a religious business, it's a seminary or a religious publisher or something, it could make a difference, okay? There are also obviously degrees of relevance. Not everything that is relevant is equally relevant. Suppose you're hiring somebody for a job. There might be 5 or 6 most important characteristics that you wish this person would have, but the first 2 might count a lot more. They might be a lot more important for your purposes than the other characteristics. While all would be relevant, they're not all equally relevant. They don't weigh the same. Now, the important addition to purpose as crucial for determining relevance. The important addition is what I called reality a minute ago. Purpose isn't enough to determine relevance. If you focus exclusively on purpose, there is a danger of lapsing into pragmatism, of thinking that we can choose or dictate what's relevant. So when I say that we've also got to check relevance by reality, what I mean is this. You must pay attention to facts of past experience that instruct you as to which characteristics are reliable indicators of the qualities that you're after. Let me say that again, just so that you get the thought. You don't need to take it down, but get the main thought there, right? You must pay attention to facts of past experience that instruct you as to which characteristics are reliable indicators of the qualities that you're after, for instance, in hiring somebody. In other words, part of how you know what's relevant is on the basis of inductions from past experience. If you learn, for instance, that intelligence is a good indicator of success in this sort of position, then that gives you reason to seek intelligence in the candidates for that position. If you're trying to determine the guilt or innocence of a defendant, there are certain things to go by and certain things not to go by. There's no correlation between perpetrators of fraud and ethnic background, or state of birth, or favorite TV show, right? So that's what I mean by saying it's past inductions that will tell you what qualities to pay attention to. This is the sense in which reality must also inform your decisions about relevance. Okay, to repeat the main claim so far then, about the nature of objectivity, an objective method consists of proceeding according to the facts, logically evaluating the relevant evidence. Thus, despite very ordinary ways of speaking, facts are not objective. That's probably familiar to many of you, but that is important. Literally speaking, facts are not objective. Objectivity refers to how we, individual human beings, treat facts, how we handle information. It's our thinking, it's our conclusions, our decisions that can be objective or non-objective. Okay? I mean, it's okay to speak that way. I'm not, again, saying, I'll never use those words, this is an objective fact or so on. But realize that strictly speaking, it's us who can be objective or non-objective. The facts are the facts. It's how we're thinking about the facts, how we're reasoning about them, that's objective or non-objective. Okay? Yeah? Okay.
Proceeding according to the facts.
Logically evaluating the relevant evidence. Okay? And I said facts are not objective, objectivity. Okay? Good. Thanks. All right. Let's put this in more colloquial terms. A person is objective when he calls it like he sees it, and he strives logically to see things the way they really are. He calls it like he sees it, and you have to get the second part, that's crucial, that, it's a two-part proposition, and he strives logically to see things as they truly are. To see things the way they really are. To be even more colloquial, I guess, okay? Calls it like he sees it, and he strives logically to see things as they truly are. Now, how does this mesh with dictionary definitions of objectivity? The dictionary is not a Bible, of course, you can't regard it as gospel truth, so to speak, but it is often helpful. So let me just read you a few definitions, okay? Again, you needn't take these down. I'll probably read them too quickly to take down, but just listen to get the general idea. The first few are from the Oxford English Dictionary. Objective. Belongs to what is presented to consciousness as opposed to the consciousness itself. Or another from the OED, the object of perception or thought as distinct from the perceiving or thinking subject. Or yet another from the OED, treating a subject so as to exhibit the actual facts, not colored by the opinions or feelings of the writer. Okay? And a few from an American definition, Webster's New World definition, dictionary. Objective, having to do with a known or perceived object as distinguished from something existing only in the mind of the subject or person thinking. Or a last one, determined by and emphasizing the features and characteristics of the object or thing dealt with rather than the thoughts, feelings, etc. of the artist, writer, or speaker. So in all of these cases, these various definitions in both dictionaries, now there were also more in both dictionaries, just so you know, okay? But in all of these cases, there's a very clear contrast between the object of perception or thought and the perceiver or the thinker, right? Also consider the roots of the word objective. Evidently, it comes from Latin. Let me write this down. This is the Latin root of the word objective. O-B-J-I-C-E-R-E, which means to throw towards or against, to place in front of. To throw towards or against, to place in front of. Just the second part of that, evidently, I don't know Latin, okay, so I'm just getting this from a few people and some dictionaries. But if you just forget about the ob for a minute, jacere, I don't know, but J-A-C-E-R-E means to throw or place. And a student once told me that you can break this down further. Ob, O-B, means in front of, and jaceo means I throw, which sets up the idea that to be objective is to recognize what is thrown in front of you, which I think is a really cool idea. Isn't that cool? I think that's right. To be objective seems, on this basis, roughly to mean to pay attention to that which is thrown in front of you, before you, right? Looking at the object. I think that's terrific. The upshot is these definitions corroborate this account of objectivity as a matter of fidelity to the object, the thing being considered, rather than to some aspect of the subject, the person doing the considering. Objectivity is a matter of being object-oriented, object-focused, object-anchored. And obviously, one second, this refers to not only physical objects, okay? Does he really love her? Well, objectively we can find out, and objectively there will be evidence for it if he really does, right? Signs of his affection. He calls, he's interested, he cares about how she's doing, he asks questions, etc., right? We can measure a baseball player's performance by the ratio of times he gets a hit to the times he had a chance to get a hit, right? His batting average, that's an objective measure. So even though I'm using the word object a lot, please remind yourselves we're not speaking exclusively of physical objects, okay? Now, only if it's really pressing am I going to take it now. Just
The dictionary definitions seem to be more intrinsic because they never focused on the purpose of the subject. For example, ignoring your feelings. Well, you're deciding who to date. You don't decide.
Okay. Yeah. Now, that's an interesting observation that the dictionary definitions I read, Evan is saying, seem more intrinsic because they're ignoring the purpose. That's true. I mean, I think the value in the ones I read is the clear contrast between the external and the perceiver, but you're right in that sometimes introspective evidence will be relevant to pay attention to. No, that's a good point. Yeah. Okay. All right. Now, still, you may want to know, you may think, but look, we have a Bible, right? We have OPAR. So how does what I've been saying so far, mesh with OPAR? In OPAR, Dr. Peikoff writes that objectivity is volitional adherence to reality by the method of logic. Volitional adherence to reality by the method of logic. Logic, he says, is the method of achieving objectivity. The standard of objectivity is sense data, i.e., observation of reality. Now, how does that mesh with what I've been saying so far? To remind you again of my general description, it was an objective method consists of proceeding according to the facts, logically evaluating the relevant evidence. Colloquially, you're objective when you call it like you see it, and you logically strive to see it the way it really is. Now, that sounds a little different from Dr. Peikoff's formulation. I think, though, that they are perfectly consistent with one another. Dr. Peikoff's is wider, obviously, and he is underscoring the volitional nature of objectivity, right? Volitional adherence to reality. I worked from examples, the ones that I recounted at the beginning, that highlighted cases where the temptation away from objectivity is particularly strong, and where the need for objectivity to resist those temptations is most vivid. So they were pretty glaring cases of non-objectivity, at least in some of the scenarios, right, that I quickly sketched. So that these examples may have skewed the discussion a bit to non-objective or wrong approaches, to distorted procedures. But objectivity, in essence, is a matter of adherence to reality, the relevant aspect of reality. That's what marks the proper thinking method in all these cases. The juror, the journalist, the research biologist, etc., right? The ones who were being objective were paying attention to the relevant evidence, the relevant aspects of reality. So I'd reiterate then that objectivity is all about, all for, aligning your beliefs with the way things really are. And in this, obviously, it sounds much like rationality. Okay. So let's consider the relationship between rationality and objectivity. Now, this is where the going gets a little bit tough today. If rationality, to think back to that, okay, if rationality is exercising your faculty to identify and integrate the material provided by your senses, following the facts, tracking the truth, and objectivity is volitional adherence to reality by the method of logic, what's the difference? Are they the same? What's the relationship between them? I have to admit, I'm not sure. I have plenty to say, but my thoughts here are more tentative than most of my thoughts on some of the other things I'm talking about, okay? So I just have to alert you. My thoughts here are tentative, and I do think this is a tricky question, and there isn't an obvious, clear answer, okay? And happily, at least, I was talking to Harry Binswanger the other night, and he at least agreed there isn't an obvious, clear answer, okay? So here's the best of my thinking to date. And I'll work by some questions, okay? Using that method of putting questions, let's do that to try to integrate our understanding of rationality and objectivity. Is one of them a species of the other or an aspect of the other? Is objectivity a particular respect in which a person can be rational or irrational? That seems too weak, because it would suggest that there are other ways of being rational without being objective. As if you might choose any of a variety of ways of being rational, and objectivity isn't essential to all of them. But objectivity is necessary for being rational. It's a prerequisite. Let's dwell on this for a moment. Consider, can you be rational without being objective? No. To be non-objective is to abandon logic or reality. I mean, think again of Dr. Peikoff's definition. Volitional adherence to reality by the method of logic. So to be non-objective would be to abandon either reality or logic, and ultimately that amounts to the same thing, okay? But if you're abandoning logic or reality, you're not heeding reality, to not heed reality is to eschew rationality. So in other words, a departure from objectivity is a departure from rationality. Objectivity seems more specific direction to go by the object, to not be distracted by other factors, emotions, desires, inappropriate purposes, right? I want my career to go well, so I'll slant the story in a certain way. So possibly objectivity has a narrower focus than reason. But it seems that you can't be rational without being objective. Rationality requires objectivity. Now I have to add a clarification here, or qualification. When I say that rationality requires objectivity, there's a possible misinterpretation that I do want to warn against. You can't shun objectivity and still be rational once you know what objectivity is and what it demands. You can be rational, I think, without being objective before you understand what objectivity is. And here's the reason I say that. Ayn Rand is the person who has fully developed the concept of objectivity. Before Rand, there were partial notions of objectivity, which Aristotle, for instance, had, but it was she who really clarified its nature, distinguished it from the intrinsic as well as the subjective, and so on. But that doesn't mean that nobody before Rand was rational. Right, or objective, actually. Yeah, okay. But, okay, so pre-Ayn Rand, pre the full development of the concept of objectivity, people could have still been, and some still were, rational, okay? Similarly, pre-Aristotle, Aristotle is the father of logic, right? And objectivity means using the method of logic, right? Pre-Aristotle, people were rational. Some people were rational, okay? Or again, a small child, before he's old enough to understand logic, can be rational. So that's why I'm adding this qualification, okay? I'm saying rationality requires objectivity once you're aware of objectivity. To deliberately shun objectivity is to shun rationality, okay? In other words, you can't say, okay, I'll be rational, but I won't be objective. You know, how much do you want, right? I'll just be rational. No, you can't do that. To shun objectivity in that way is to shun rationality, okay? All right, so again, that was a qualification on the claim that rationality requires objectivity. Let's consider the reverse question. Is it possible to be objective without being rational? Is it possible to be objective without being rational? One case. Suppose a person is objective. He sets aside irrelevant considerations, but he makes a mistake in drawing inferences about the evidence that he weighs. Okay? Even though he has really set aside irrelevancies, he makes a mistake in his thinking, his inferring about the evidence that he considers. Is that a case of being objective, because he set aside irrelevancies, but not being rational? No, because it's not a case of not being rational. Honest mistakes do not render your process irrational. His method was correct. His understanding of some issue might be naive, undeveloped, incomplete, such that he doesn't yet possess the ability to recognize certain implications. But if you identify and integrate logically as best you can at your current state of knowledge, you are being rational. Okay? So that wouldn't be a case of being objective without being rational. That person was rational, he just made a mistake. So consider another case. Again, to consider whether a person might be objective without being rational. Suppose a teacher or a referee is trying to be fair, to exclude irrelevant evidence, but that this person holds incorrect premises. That will obviously influence what he considers relevant, and thus how objective he is really being. For instance, if the teacher thinks that a student's background or needs matter to what grade that student should receive. Or if a referee thinks that the fact that your team won the championship last year should count against your winning this year. These sorts of cases suggest that true, full-blooded objectivity requires rationality, true premises, correct identifications all the way down. In other words, they suggest that you can't be truly, fully, unqualifiedly objective without being rational. Okay? So do rationality and objectivity amount to the same thing? Are they interchangeable? Such that if you are objective, you're doing all you need to be rational. Or is objectivity narrower, concerned only with how you treat the information in front of you, while perhaps reason is wider, requiring that you seek out information? That doesn't seem quite right either. Objectivity demands that you search for the relevant evidence. An objective person cannot wear blinders and assess only what's directly or easily in front of him. To be objective, you can't be passive or indifferent to potentially relevant evidence. Remember, objectivity demands that you strive to see things the way they are. In OPAR, again, Dr. Peikoff writes that logic, which objectivity demands, right, the method of logic, logic requires non-contradictory identification within the full context of your knowledge, methodically surveyed. In other words, you've got to work to be objective. All right? Okay, but again, that still leaves the question, but are reason and objectivity interchangeable? Are they the same thing? My answer is not quite. I think they're extremely close, but not quite interchangeable. In one sense, essentially they refer to the same basic method. Proceeding by the relevant facts. Identifying and integrating your observation of reality without contradiction. The difference may be largely one of focus or emphasis. One or the other, telling yourself to be rational or objective, might be more helpful to you in different circumstances. If you tell yourself, be rational, that's very broad. Now, sometimes that might be enough to get you to be rational and objective, right? But sometimes that will be too broad, and sometimes reminding yourself to be objective can better attune you to what to exclude. It might conjure certain mistakes to be wary of. So reason, I think, does seem wider than objectivity. Insofar as objectivity says, use logic. Make it your policy to align your thinking with reality by employing logic. It provides more specific instruction. Both reason and objectivity share the same aim. They're both after the same thing, grasp of reality. Rationality tells you what to do, you might say. Rationality says, identify and integrate. Objectivity offers more concrete guidance for how to do it. Follow the method of logic, okay? Objectivity involves self-conscious dedication to the method of logic, so it involves self-monitoring, a certain discipline. And perhaps by stressing, as Dr. Peikoff does, that objectivity is volitional adherence to reality, perhaps that volitional is meant in part to imply this self-conscious commitment to being logical in one's thinking. Okay? All right. How are you doing? That was a lot of hard stuff. And let me just pause, and if there are one or two questions right now, let me take them. Yes? Yeah.
Because definition of objective did not include a purpose as a function of...
Right. Well, volitional adherence to reality by the method of logic. Now, the reason why one is going to want to adhere to reality one will always have a reason. So the way to adhere to reality in one case will depend on the purpose of what you're doing, right? You know, Sandra gives me a list of papers to sort. Well, what do you want? What's your purpose here? That'll tell me what's relevant and how to be objective in sorting out the papers. The purpose of the trial will tell me what aspects of reality to adhere to. So I think, adhere to reality by the method of logic, that is what objectivity is in all cases. Then to determine how to be objective in a specific case, trying a defendant, writing a newspaper article, sorting papers, awarding city council contracts, I've got to figure out what aspects of reality am I interested in here to serve, well, what is the purpose of the enterprise here? Okay? Okay, good. One more for now, yeah.
It seems to me that in usage, objectivity usually, it seems to me, refers more to perception than other aspects of it.
To perception?
Yeah, it seems to me it's more frequently used with respect to perception.
Okay.
How you got the data, and then rationality covers that, and then what you do with the information you have.
Okay. The question or comment is that objectivity, I think it's right. It seems like objectivity is used at least.
Usage that
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure I agree that the usage of objectivity refers more to perception. In some cases, perception is going to be what's relevant. But notice in a lot of these, again, I think fairly simple examples, it's your concept of whether or not, the research biologist, well, actually, he's perceiving certain things, right? But whether the process that he's engaged in, in the past 2 years, which we are not now perceptually observing, whether that process was objective or not, involves concepts. The juror is, he wasn't there. He didn't see the crime, or he didn't see where the alleged criminal was, and so on. So it certainly often comes up in conceptual judgments, okay? It's conceptual judgments where people are more inclined to argue about whether or not this is an objective claim, that people really have rights, that this society really is just, right? When there's perceptual evidence in front of people, literally in front of two disputing people, it's a lot harder for them to have that dispute. Okay? Okay, last one. Yes?
I'm wondering about the term logic in the definition of objectivity. And it seems that logic's been used as something smaller than reason. And I'm wondering if the relationship hinges on that. And that why, for instance, isn't the definition of objectivity the volitional adherence to reality by a method of reason?
That's a fair question, and all I can say is this. And this is, I think, part of why it is so vexing, or if not, vexing actually I think is misleading. I think really, again, essentially reason and objectivity refer to the same thing. Essentially what they're telling you to do is the same, and it's after the same thing, grasp of reality. Because I was looking at this in OPAR fairly closely just a few days ago, and at one point, I think it's on the same page that Dr. Peikoff says, the method of objectivity is logic. Logic is a matter of reason. Well, then, in effect, he is telling you, right, if logic is a matter of reason and objectivity requires logic, it's another way of saying it requires reason. So I think, in a way, these are really fine points, okay? That doesn't mean, I think there's still some reason to ask the question, are they one and the same thing or not? Why? There's practical payoff there. If they're not one and the same thing, if there is any difference between objectivity and rationality, and you want to be both objective and rational, you want to find out what the difference is so that you're not settling for everything rationality requires, but not, if there are extra steps to go to be objective, you want to know what those extra steps are, okay? So it's not just a kind of, scholastic question, oh, gee, what's the relationship, okay? It makes a difference because the more fully you understand the demands of both, the more fully you can be rational and objective. Okay. All right, let me get back, though, to the next item on the agenda. Why be objective? Why is objectivity appropriate or valuable? Now, by this stage in the week, it probably isn't difficult to see. And particularly given the close relationship of objectivity to rationality, you might think, good, we can make quick work of this. But there is a complication. That ever-expanding contingent of people insisting that objectivity is impossible. The increasingly familiar refrain received as common knowledge that no one can be objective, however hard they try. Again, we've already alluded to this. I won't give you still further examples or quotations of this. But we do have to preface our discussion of the propriety of objectivity by addressing attacks on it, attacks on its possibility, okay? So, the basic attack that one frequently encounters, alleging the impossibility of objectivity. Basic attack goes like this. Each person has a particular, unique perspective on the world. That's a function of that person's biology, his social circumstances, his physical and mental endowments, his background, his family, their income, their level of culture, his past experience, the general beliefs and practices in the society around him, etc. All of these things shade the way an individual thinks about things, the way you perceive things. Consequently, objectivity is impossible. A person's background, experience, pre-existing beliefs inevitably influence how he sees things and the conclusions that he draws. Neutral, third-party, bird's-eye perspectives are unattainable, beyond our reach, and this allegedly precludes objectivity. If there are no pure claims uninfected by a given individual's perceptual peculiarities, by his particular background, no objective knowledge is available, runs the argument. Even in a dispute between two people, they can't figure out how to interpret the data that it might seem would settle that dispute because their ways of interpreting the data are inevitably theory-laden, prejudiced by their own preconceptions. Okay? You can't shed your perspective, is the claim. Even when you're looking right at something, it's your eyes that affect the way it looks to you. All our conclusions are processed. You can't shed your perspective. All observations, all claims are theory-laden. Again, I imagine this is sickeningly familiar. Okay? What's wrong with this position? What's wrong with this reasoning for the impossibility of objectivity? You know what's wrong with it? The same thing that's wrong with any mistaken view. It's false to reality. What do I mean? Our perceptions are not theory-laden. It's perceptions that prompt us to formulate theories. Consider, what theory does an infant employ as it first observes its mother, its father, the crib it's in, the mobile hanging over the crib, the ball beside it, etc.? What theory is a little infant employing as it has those perceptions? Once it's, old enough and mature enough neurologically to have actual perceptions, okay? And this might take a little bit of time. But once it's having perceptions, what theory is it employing to have those perceptions? What theory are you or I relying on when we look at the front of the room and observe the board or the lectern? What theory are you relying on when you feel an ache in your tooth? Or when you hear a rumble of thunder in the sky, right? A baby gradually learns words for various objects. Gradually, right? Now that obviously takes months, okay? Does that make it theory-laden, its observations? Does that slant what's going on when the baby sees its mother, feels the crib, etc.? A name is not a theory. So naming things, eventually, that can't be the same as accepting a theory as something that slants your perceptions. Notice something. If a name were a theory, then the only way to escape the prejudice of theory would be by not naming anything, right? By living like savages. If to name things is to impose a worldview and preempt the possibility of objectivity, then epistemological innocence requires ignorance. Epistemological virtue would lie in the opposite of reasoning. This attack on objectivity demands irrationality. It shows utter contempt for the demands of rationality, identifying what your senses observe. Correspondingly, this attack is a direct assault on reality. It preaches defiance of reality. Logic, we know, rests in recognizing consistently, unfailingly, that A is A. The objectivity is impossible contingent, the sort who make the kind of argument I just recounted, they're claiming your A isn't my A, right? Your A is Western, 20th century, male or female, etc., right? Now, who's right? Put it to the test of reality. Try a society that respects individual freedom and a society that doesn't, that's based on force, right? Look at what the standard of living is in those two societies. Look at the life expectancy. Is it 20? Is it 50? Is it 70? Try treating cancer with chemotherapy and radiation or with prayer, facing Mecca every morning. Try drinking a bottle of Drano. See what happens. Right? This is the test of reality. You can try it in Topeka, you can try it in Tehran, Torremolinos, you can try women and children first if you want to see, well, is this male or female truth, right? Try women and children before you try the men, right? The point is, reality isn't malleable. It's not variable depending on your background or your mindset. Such primacy of consciousness is false to the facts. Now, to go a little bit further with this, since this position, objectivity is impossible, is built on false premises, naturally we find further confusions infecting it. To contend that we are naturally biased misrepresents what bias or non-objectivity is. Whether a person is objective or not is under that person's control. That's why bias is a legitimate object of criticism, right? That's why it's perfectly appropriate to condemn bias, because you didn't have to be biased. It was up to you whether or not you gave in to bias or not. It makes no sense to apply a charge of bias or non-objectivity to that portion of a person over which he does not exercise control, to his inescapable metaphysical nature, the fact that he has eyes or ears or parents, right? Or he grew up in a specific state at a specific time. Objectivity pertains only to thoughts that a person chooses, that he can adopt or reject. Now, the grain of truth in this attack on objectivity is that, yes, we do have specific equipment through which we observe the world. We don't experience direct, immediate apprehension of reality. It's true that you are you, with your eyes, your ears, your parents, etc. But that hardly shows what the opponents of objectivity think it does. And Rand provided a very decisive response to this view. Now, for the sake of time, I won't read one of the two passages I was going to. I'll just go to what seems to be becoming the passage of the conference, because Binswanger and Schwartz have already quoted it. But essentially, there was the famous response to Kantianism. Notice, this whole attack, your observations are theory-laden, you can't be objective, is just a clear variant of Kantianism, right? Which, at her most devastating, Rand responded to with the famous passage that their reasoning was essentially, man is limited to a consciousness of a specific nature, which perceives by specific means and no others, therefore his consciousness is not valid. Man is blind because he has eyes, deaf because he has ears, deluded because he has a mind. In other words, far from these observations that the critics make, far from those observations disqualifying a person's conclusions from being objective, they point to things that enable us to reach objective conclusions. Think of it this way. No person's beliefs are to be accepted or taken as true just because they're his beliefs, just because he believes them. Individuals can be mistaken. Thus, we must verify our beliefs. The fact that you are not automatically correct is the reason why you should strive to be objective, to compensate for that very fact. Right? If I'm not automatically correct, I've got to make sure. The way to make sure is by using logic, by being objective. So in other words, these facts that they point out about us, well, you have your particular background, your particular eyesight, etc., don't defeat or preclude objectivity. They make the objective method necessary. They are what mandate volitional adherence to reality. You've got to choose to employ logic to discover the way things really are. A given thing isn't objectively valid just because I believe it, but nor is it barred from being objectively valid because I believe it. Whether it's objectively valid depends on the logic of my procedure, how I came to believe it, how I was led to this conclusion. Bias is a matter of basis, the basis on which you accept the basis on which you accept certain ideas, okay? Bias is a matter of basis. There's no such thing as kind of an innate bias. But that's essentially what they're alleging when they say objectivity is impossible. We're all born and can't get rid of slanted viewpoints. Okay. All right. A minute or two for questions. Let's draw a line there. Yes?
With respect to the relationship between rationality and objectivity, what about the idea that rationality is the fundamental virtue, but objectivity is the virtue which brings relevant right knowledge? So in other words,
sorry, but I guess I don't see why you want to say the one is the fundamental virtue and rationality brings knowledge. If you're identifying and integrating the facts, right, that can bring knowledge.
but it applies to everything, whereas objectivity applies to knowledge in particular.
Well, I'm not sure I understand what you mean by saying objectivity applies to knowledge. Using reason is a means of gaining knowledge. Doesn't that apply to knowledge?
I guess maybe there's a differentiation between rationality and reason. Reason is a means to knowledge. Rationality is the virtue.
Well, rationality is the process that you should engage in, right, to use your rational faculty, your reason, to gain knowledge. But I think, okay. But I'm sorry, but I'm just not immediately seeing, maybe we can talk further, but I'm not immediately seeing the kinds of differences between rationality and objectivity that you're raising, okay? Yes, in the back.
Here's another way to think about it. Rationality is the general way in which rationality and irrationality are the two general ways in which you can use your mind. Objectivity refers to the specific way in which you grasp ideas, and the purpose of the concept is to distinguish the proper way of grasping ideas from the two improper ways, in other words, the two forms of subjectivism, outright subjectivism and empiricism.
Okay. Well, it's true that, with objectivity, a concept that Rand developed by developing her theory of concept formation, that's what led her to the whole concept of objectivity. It's true that we get there the very rich contrast between the subjective, which was somewhat familiar, and the intrinsic, which was a really terrific identification of her on her part, right? So it's in a certain sense, a richer concept. A richer concept. Sorry, now I'm blanking out on some of the first part of what you were saying.
All I said was that rationality versus irrational. In other words, rationality distinguishes the proper way to use your mind in general against all the myriad ways of using it improperly.
Right.
But objectivity talks about, if you look at Dr. Peikoff's definitions in OPAR, objectivity, intrinsicism, and subjectivism are all start out with the grasp of an idea. So the point is that those objectivity shows the proper way to grasp ideas, and that's the purpose of the concept. And it as opposed to what, as Dr. Binsweier always asks, well, as opposed to the two forms of subjectivism, outright subjectivism and intrinsicism.
Right. I guess the only additions I would make, are, but look, rationality is also a matter of grasping ideas. What is this? Now, sometimes what is this physical object that somebody has put in front of me? What is this idea my friend has just suggested to me over dinner, right? Identifying that as thoroughly and precisely as I can is a matter of following reason, but it can be grasp of ideas, okay? And the other thing is, even though, part of what the value of understanding objectivity is the contrast with the intrinsic and the subjective, let's not leave logic out of it, right? There's a real emphasis on when you're being objective, you are using logic. So that means with objectivity, there's a certain self-consciousness about a proper method, about a way of being rational. And that's why right now I'm inclined to think rationality is a little bit broader than objectivity. It tells you what to do, identify, and integrate. Being objective does give you more information as to how to do it. use logic. You're going to have to turn your mind on. This is a volitional business, and in a very self-conscious, deliberate, disciplined manner, you're going to have to adhere to logic. Okay? We are over time. Sorry. Some more tomorrow.